Awesome. So thanks for joining us today on Influencing the Shift 3.0. My name's Cassie, and I'm going to be your host today. And I am joined by the lovely Stephanie Dixon. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stephanie. This is really exciting to have you as our opening speaker. You're definitely someone that's influenced the sport community on a very elite level. I'm hoping you can just start with a quick introduction about yourself and who you are.
Sure. Yes, I'm Stephanie Dixon, and I've competed in 3 Paralympic Games for Canada in swimming. I competed in 2000, 2004, and 2008. And since then, I've remained quite heavily involved in the Paralympic movement. I have served as a broadcaster, an ambassador, assistant chef de mission, and most recently chef de mission of the 2020 Paralympic Games. And currently, I am at the University of Toronto, completing a master's in kinesiology with a focus on safe, inclusive, and rights-based sport.
Well, you are the right person to have for this conversation then. I'm very excited to have you speak to a couple of those specific issues, because really what this Influencing the Shift conference is about is a time to influence the sport and recreation sector in kind of ways that they can introduce more inclusive environments to persons with disability. And here in Nova Scotia, we actually specifically collected some data from the community sport organization in early spring to help kind of like lead these conversations and just kind of answer some of the questions that they have from, people that are experts in this field. So I think this is perfectly fitted. So recognizing that you are an elite athlete, can you reflect on those earlier years of your experience in sport? And specifically, what were some of those pinnacle moments for you that you think helped you progress in sport and your career in sport?
Great question. Background. So I think it's important to state that I have a congenital disability. So I was born missing my right leg. Actually, I don't like saying it that way. I was born with one leg because I wasn't missing anything. I was born just great. I'm trying to be more aware these days. I think words matter. And I think that it's really important for all of us to reflect as we try and create more inclusive and safe environments for people. And I'm reflecting a lot on the narrative I've told about myself and saying things like, despite being born with one leg, or I was born missing a leg. I don't think it's helpful in creating those inclusive spaces. So that's why I jumped on top of myself for using those kinds of words. So I mentioned having a congenital disability because having my body, I guess you can call it a disabled body, having one leg is something that I've had all my life. And I never viewed myself as somebody who was disabled. We didn't really use that word too much growing up. I wore a prosthetic leg sometimes and not other times because it really in my family was viewed as a tool that, if I would be walking a lot that day, then maybe it made sense to have my prosthetic leg on. But if I was going and playing gymnastics or going to the park, then I would just leave it at home because it would only get in my way. So growing up, disability was, it was not something at the forefront of my mind. And I was put into many different sports. And I think that, well, first of all, I didn't know parasport existed. I didn't know about the Paralympic Games. And I think that my family thought that it was a good thing to not talk about disability and I don't think they knew about parasport at the time. So I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think looking back now, it would have been very helpful to learn about disability and parasport, because as I got older, I started to really struggle with wanting to identify as a person with a disability. So I got involved in competitive swimming and thought I was just one of everybody. And at my first competition, I was told there were special meets for special people like me, and I could, go to this other place. And the official was trying to tell me about parasport, but really, as a young 12-year-old, all I heard was, "You don't belong here. You belong somewhere else with other people like you. You're not like everybody else." So I really struggled with parasport in the beginning, and I resisted it quite a lot. I thought other people are disabled. I'm not disabled because of the negative connotation we have in our society of what having a disability is. And as a young 12-year-old, already from the messaging of society, I thought it meant that you're less capable,
Yeah.
that you should have less expectations upon yourself. People felt sorry for you. You know, all of those things came to my mind, and I did not want to be part of it. Very fortunately, I had a coach and parents who recognized that it would be really good for me to tackle some of those stereotypes and to be proud of who I was. So they encouraged me to get to know parasport a bit better, join a parasport competition because I qualified for nationals for swimmers with a disability. At the same time, I think I was more at like a regional provincial level for swimmers who didn't have a disability.
Wow.
And they encouraged me to do both, to try both, see how it goes. So at my first competition for swimmers with a disability, it was my first time interacting with athletes who also had disabilities, and the first time that I think my image of what having a disability meant started to be chipped away at. And I met other athletes who were just like me, who loved to push themselves, and who didn't fit into this mold of what a disabled athlete in my mind was. And I started to question things. But of course, I'm a young teenager at this point in time. So it's not like I had a very sophisticated epiphany or anything, but I started to recognize that parasport maybe wasn't a bad thing.
Yeah, and I
And
think like you hit too, like being in high school, like that's our identity making years, right? So that's like such a crucial time to be exposed to healthy, ways to see yourself and to shape yourself. So that's really interesting to me that it kind of occurred during that time for
yeah,
you.
it's it.
Yeah.
Well, and also it wasn't suddenly like this linear jump to, oh, being a disabled person's fine. It certainly wasn't like that, because I would have positive experiences meeting other athletes with a disability, but then at the same time I would encounter coaches who certainly use the language and mannerisms of feeling sorry for me.
Mhm.
And so it wasn't a quick shift. And still, you look in the media in the early 90s, and how were people with disability portrayed? How were they talked about? And so I think it was this interesting back and forth where I was like, oh, maybe having a disability isn't a bad thing. Oh, yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. And so in those formative years, it was, I would say, very confusing. And I wish that I had had more people to talk to about it. And I'm so glad nowadays we're having these conversations. And maybe if I had seen a speaker series like this, it would have been really helpful. But back then we weren't talking about it. And diversity, equity, and inclusion weren't everyday words that were being used. So I'm really happy to see the shift that's being made. And we obviously have a very long way to go. And I don't want to downplay the barriers that people with disabilities still experience, but I certainly think that the conversation is shifting. And I'm very excited for young people with disability to maybe be armed with a bit more support and resources and tools to help them navigate their identity as they come to terms with their bodies and trying to feel proud of who they are in a world that makes it challenging.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't have said it better yourself. And I mean, if I found it challenging as a teenager, I couldn't imagine, the others that experience other barriers, that it's just like, oh my gosh, like being a teen these days, is it good or bad that we have social media? I always wonder that in my head, because in some ways it's like creating, like you said, these platforms for us to be able to like see ourselves reflected. And I think that's a really interesting time to be going through that growth and experience. So let's influence it in such a like a positive way, and how can and recognizing that this is an opportunity to do that. So
Absolutely. And
yeah.
yeah, I think there's an emerging new message of you deserve better for people with disability, and anyone who identifies with a group that's been marginalized in society. So whether that's being racialized, ableism, homophobia, like any person that feels and experiences barriers and marginalization, I think there's this emerging message of you deserve better, because growing up, it's certainly in sport, in and out of sport, I felt it was my job to navigate a system and attitudes that didn't empower me. And and I truly did. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I thought, oh, maybe I was owed more than this.
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited that there is an emerging message, and it's becoming louder all the time, that people deserve much better than what is currently happening.
So like when you were in your younger years, especially being introduced to, you said you were involved in many sports growing up, were the coaches, or do you find your parents were more the advocates in keeping you there throughout those
Mm.
younger years of your life? Or was there other components that kind of trickled into, I mean, as a young person, 12, 11, sometimes we don't even pay attention to those pieces that are happening. You're just going to play a sport. You're just, mom drops me off, I'm going to the sport. So I guess
Thank
more so as an adult, do you reflect back, and you say in some ways you have, like, yeah, have you thought about what other components may have or contributed to that
you.
experience?
My mom talked a lot about when she gave birth to a child that's body was atypical or will be experienced as a person with a disability in society, that she knew that it would be hard for me, and she really never thought my body would challenge me. It would be society and the way that I was viewed. So very purposefully, my parents put me in as many sports as possible when I was young, so that by the time I experienced the stigma of disability, I would already have so many experiences, so much evidence that I was capable and that I was strong, and my body could empower me, and I didn't have to feel ashamed of it. They thought that was really important, and so I cannot thank them enough for that, because it's not always the path that is taken, and I think that a lot of times parents think they have to protect their child with a disability, and I think my parents thought that too, but the protection looked like sending me out the door and learning that my body was amazing and perfect, um, and so they really intentionally and purposefully put me in baseball and softball, soccer, gymnastics, horseback riding when I was really young. And I think swimming was probably the first sport. When I was 2, they just put me in the water and let me figure things out on my own. And there's been a lot of stories I've heard about, it took me longer to learn how to crawl, for example. I had two arms and one leg, and it would have been so easy for them just to pick me up and carry me around everywhere, seeing me struggling. But they gave me the time and space that I needed to figure out how to do things for myself. And I hurt myself a lot. I mean, I broke my left arm twice in the year I was two times. And child services were called on my parents, because if a child shows up twice in the hospital with a broken arm in the same year, I mean, it doesn't look good. And but and that must have been so hard for them. And when a disabled kid falls down, parents look to my parents like, aren't you going to pick up your kid? Aren't you going to? And they would just stand back. And that must have been so hard for them. I can't imagine. But they created the space for me to pick myself back up. And that is what kept me in sport, because I loved challenging myself. I loved figuring out how to do things in a way that made sense for me and my body. I learned to walk on my hands, I think, when I was 8 years old. And I have distinct memories at recess in grade 3 of walking on my hands and the kids in my class counting the steps that I could take on my hands. And that was because my parents, they just created that space.
That's
And so I'm
amazing.
very, very grateful to them for that, and made sport and movement a positive thing in my life.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that just speaks to like the power of sport, like in recreation. Like I always think sometimes maybe I'm being a bit biased here, but like COVID is really magnified in some ways this like time of like how important and how much it can really impact our lives through recreation and sport. And I think these stories kind of show that it's been doing it for longer than just now, even though we're now getting this like recognition of the importance and the value of mental health, et cetera. So hearing your story and like knowing that your parents use sport as this tool to really empower you is just amazing and really like inspiring because, and I think like for you to go to that elite level at the end of it all is even more so like just like this wow factor. Whereas, I think there's also importance to recognize that some people, just play sport for sport and don't ever reach that level. And that's okay too, because if it's still giving you that, that confidence or that, sense of power and purpose, then like, yeah, like it's really interesting to me how the different versatile ways sport can play a role and how it can lead our lives.
And every kid deserves the opportunity, because I think there's a couple things in my experience. One, I had very strong parents, and I remember being told, I went through gymnastics and got to a certain point where they said she can't go any further. With her body, she's not going to make the next levels. And my mom, I guess, or my parents decided at that point not to fight the system, but let's go find a sport that will welcome our daughter. And I don't remember any of this. I just remember being told the stories of it. And then in swimming, I remember making it to the provincial level. And I made a final at provincials, and they said, oh no, she can't compete in this final because she's a para athlete, and this is for mainstream athletes. And my mom did go to bat on that one. She fought hard for that one. And then that year I competed in both provincials for swimmers with a disability as well as mainstream athletes. And so it wasn't easy. So I think when we say sport is empowering, I absolutely agree that movement is empowering, but the politics of sport is certainly challenging, and it's not a space where all kids feel welcome. And we need to change that, because my disability and my body allows me to participate in most mainstream sports. And I would say I experience mostly attitude oppression, or oppression from people's attitudes, rather than I'm not physically able to participate, where there's lots of kids that this program, either the building's not accessible, or the sport is done in a way that some bodies just are welcome, they're not included. And so I think that we have to make that distinction, that movement is so empowering and all kids deserve that opportunity, whether it's recreational or to pursue their high performance dreams. But the politics of sport and the way that it's governed, and that is not empowering, and that's what we need to change. That's absolutely what we need to change.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's a really good lead into our next question, actually, which is, and I think this is where even your master's work comes into the conversation a bit, because I'm essentially asking you like what you think a fully inclusive community sport experience would look like for like anybody, really, right? Which is a very broad question. But like, in terms of like, yeah, I think it's important for people to know like what would be your wish list, what would be your idealistic, like inclusive community sport experience that that any person from walking into the door, or even retracting that, getting to the space, right, that the activity is happening at, and then getting through the door. Like I have my own idea, but like I'm curious, like what you think is, yeah, considered, or where we need to go in terms of characteristics or idealistics for a fully inclusive community sport experience. So
it's a huge question, and I won't pretend to have any kind of concrete answers or be an expert in this. But what I'm learning through my master's program and through my own reflections of my experience and my conditioning in our ableist society, my reflections and thoughts are this. I would love to see physically a universal design of buildings. So I know it would be very hard to go back and retrofit all buildings to be universally accessible, but moving forward, I would love to see any new buildings, especially recreational facilities, have a universal design. And that's not an easy task, but there are examples out there. We're starting to see a lot more, I guess, prototypes or examples of what universal design looks like. And so from a physical standpoint, that everyone can get into the building in the most dignified way. So not, oh, there's a ramp out back that you can go in and beside the garbage cans get into, nothing like that. No, this building from start to finish welcomes everyone from a physical standpoint. And then from an emotional or cultural standpoint, you have to wonder what pictures are on the walls, and is there braille, and I will absolutely not even pretend a little bit to know all of the different components. But I think that's where the lived experience comes in, is that you ask people who have so many different types of bodies and lived experiences in this world and different cultural backgrounds, what feels inclusive for them and what experiences have they had. So are the walls of this building covered with old white dudes who don't have disability? Maybe
Yeah.
that's the history of this sport and this facility. Does that make somebody else feel welcome? Probably not. And so just things like that kind of decoration, the space, the lighting, the noise, the sensory environment. There's so many things. So I think asking people with lived experience, but not expecting them to solve the problems or be the experts. So it's okay, let's get people's experiences and then bring in experts, because more and more there are people who have degrees or are studying and learning best practices of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's bring in some people, because somebody who lives with a disability is not necessarily an expert in accessibility. They can, like, I can talk to you about my experience, but do I know the best practices for all people? No. So I think that's a big distinction that we have to make, is yes, talk to your community, get lived experience perspectives, and then also bring in experts. Because I think in sport and recreation, in the past, historically, we've brought in experts in sport, in sport and recreation, and that's great. But now we recognize there's a lot of people missing from sport and recreation in our communities. And so how do we build those bridges? And it certainly does not look like, well, we have an open door, anyone is welcome. Because when you've been somebody who's felt excluded, marginalized, pushed away from certain communities, just because the door is open doesn't mean you're gonna go and think, oh great, I'm gonna participate now. Effort, money, resources need to be put into building bridges and purposefully reaching out and establishing relationships with communities of people who have been excluded and left out, to build trust. Because I think that's a huge one. That's absolutely a huge one, is not just thinking, well, the door's open, people will come. No,
Yeah.
we have to go out of our way to make sure that people who have historically been left out recognize that we are putting intentional and meaningful effort into making this a better experience for you. And then slowly but surely, I think we'll start to move forward.
Yeah, and I think you like hit on a really interesting point there, because so my role, I'm a sport and recreation inclusion consultant. So I support all our organizations across the province. And it's definitely this, we know it's important attitude, but we're kind of scared, like, where do we start? Like, how do we, and without offending anyone, and that's what makes this work so hard, is because, I feel like there are some unknowns with this work, and I think that
Yeah.
as an organization, it's like, I don't want to offend anyone by trying.
You know what, Cassie, thank you for bringing that up. That's actually, I'd like to go back, and my very first point would be acknowledge that something is deficient. So an organization could acknowledge it and then say, we're going to do the best we can, but of course we're going to fumble along the way. I think acknowledging it is it goes a long way, instead of thinking we're just going to go in and solve all these issues, because it doesn't work. You're right, it doesn't work like that. Likely at some point, language that hurts somebody will be used, or a practice that excludes somebody will have. It's not obvious. There are unknowns, and I think acknowledgement goes a long way. Saying, you know what, historically, we have done a poor job at welcoming everybody, these
Yeah.
groups of people. We want to do better. We would really appreciate any feedback that you have for us. I've been in a workshop, and the first thing in the workshop was, we recognize that that we are all trying to do the best we can for accessibility and inclusion. We have a long way to go. Any thoughts and feedback you have, please let us know how we can make this experience better for you. And it was just stated up front. And I thought that was really powerful. And yeah, because that changes the power imbalance. It brings it down a little bit when you can just say, I actually don't know what I'm doing. And I recognize I haven't, and this organization hasn't done a good enough job. But we are committed to doing better. And here are the steps that we're going to take. Please let us know if you have other suggestions.
Yeah, I think, and that's why like I encourage, organizations to really think about like, when you say the word inclusion, when you say the term accessibility, who are you thinking about? Who are you addressing? And use that as your starting point because, I think it's a bit naive to assume we're going to be able to just make everyone feel included right from the get-go. It's just not going to happen. And that's where I enjoyed your point around, reach out to your community members. Who is your community? Like it takes time and it does take resources, but in the end, your product's going to be so much more sustainable in, I think, some ways because of the fact that you've done that recognition work and worked with your community to make a product that's, going to be used.
and, and Cassie, I think the word inclusion, I like to bring this up because I think it's a dangerous word because it's too broad. It's much too broad. And can we ever include everybody? If I'm going to have a program in Toronto, am I including somebody from Winnipeg? No, what does inclusion mean? And it's too big and broad of a word. And I think it's an easy like catchphrase that people are using, and it's good that it's more of a part of our conversation and our vernacular. But at the end of the day, let's be specific. Like you said, who are you thinking about? Who are you trying to reach out to? And let's address what's happening here. Is it ableism? Is it anti-racism? Is it, what are we really trying to work towards here? And if you name it, I think it's easier. This is Brene Brown. If you name something, it's easier to address.
It's so true though, right? Like and conceptually, you're like, okay, I know what I'm trying to do now. like
instead of just inclusion, it's like this kind of abstract. Yeah, it's really hard to pin down. Well, what does that mean? And each year, maybe just choosing a couple things to tackle and saying, yes, like this is something that's a long-term, continuous goal. But this year, this is what we're going to do.
Exactly.
Or maybe undo, because
yes,
we need to dismantle a lot of oppressive systems. I mean, again, a lot of big words there, but I think do and undo is important.
I couldn't agree more. So yes, this is a really enjoyable conversation for me. I always thrive off of other people's thoughts in this area. So you are to me an expert in this. So hearing your thoughts is just, I'm like, yes, cheerleading on. So I do recognize time. So I'm going to ask you the final question because it is another kind of biggie. So as communities, and I think we've kind of touched on this a bit, but like as communities recognize the importance of including underrepresented groups in mainstream sport and recreation opportunities, what do you think are the tools or resources or supports that need to be developed and sustained in order for inclusive community sport programming to, include persons with disability? And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning around how this, like our structure in general in sport needs to change from a political, or I don't know if that's the right word, political standpoint I'm going to use. So I don't know if maybe you want to start there and kind of touch on that more but yeah, what are your thoughts around that?
What are my thoughts? So because you've used the word political, my mind goes there, and I think from who's giving the money and what is it for? So if we think about our funders, that's usually federal, provincial, territorial governments that fund sport and recreation, whether it's at a school level or outside of school programs. And I think there needs to be incentive. There needs to be some kind of incentives, because at the end of the day, sport and recreation in Canada is not free, and money is always tight. And people will think, well, who are the most people I can reach with this amount of money? And usually that is what creates marginalization of, because adaptive equipment is expensive, and going out of your way to develop relationships and bring other people, it costs money.
Yeah.
So I think that from a political standpoint, if we want more people to feel included and welcome in sport in Canada, we need those political systems to invest in it, and then to provide incentives. A lot of sport and recreation, my goodness, it's done by volunteers, isn't it? And people's time. And so we need to be very conscious of that and not put this massive extra responsibility on a parent who's already stretched thin to then now not only run this program, but now you need to be an expert in inclusion and diversity, and you need to fix all of these problems. So I think we need to really think about the money, the resources, and then provide incentives for different sport organizations. And I don't know if that is, having different, if there's evaluations, and you can have kind of a stamp, gold, silver, bronze stamps for how, but there needs to be some kind of evaluation and incentive for I would love to see evaluation of sport and recreation, because it is something that is so important. And at the end of the year, how many kids are actually asked, how was your experience? Or there to be numbers. And now going in I'm sorry, my mind's going in a million directions, going in different places. Well, how do we measure success? And this is something that I have learned from my mentors as I go along the sport and inclusion and rights-based sport pathway, is what is that measure of success? And as of right now, usually measure of success in sport is Olympic and Paralympic medals. And that's just, it's such a high level and a very, very narrow way of looking at it. But if we want sport and recreation to be successful in Canada, I truly believe it's the number of opportunities provided for all Canadians to participate in sport and recreation. And then that will fuel heading up into more high performance aspects of sport. But first, every single Canadian needs to have access. And so if we had an evaluation system for what was the experience of the kids or the people in this sport program, and what percentage of your community was able to participate, and then go from there. And there's incentives to increase those measures and to do better. And yeah, so that's from a very, very political standpoint. And then from a practical on the ground standpoint, I think we have to really give thought to adaptive sport. And so I think at a recreational level, I go back and forth. I don't know where I stand on this, but adaptive para programs versus mainstream programs. Mm-hmm. And of course you need specialized equipment and tools and resources for some bodies to participate in sport, but you don't want to just take kids and put them over here. Well, okay, you're going to go play wheelchair basketball, you're going to go play bocce over there, and then everyone else over here. I think that there's a way that we can do lots of different things. And so whether it's, we're going to have wheelchair basketball and bocce over here, and kids with and without disabilities will participate in that. I think there has to be a way that we can provide the right tools and resources for all bodies to move and participate in sport and recreation while not segregating that population. Yeah. And because I wonder, because as it exists today, most mainstream programs do not have the adaptive equipment or the tools to welcome all bodies into their programs. And I think, we need adaptive programs, we need para programs, but I'm very, very conscious of the harm from feeling othered, because I felt so othered growing up. And so somehow there needs to be a way of marrying those two things together. And I do think it's possible in sport and recreation for there to be a place for, because it's not just options in sports in terms of equipment needed, but also interest. I think that's the thing, is you want to provide as many opportunities as possible, because maybe someone doesn't like wheelchair basketball, maybe they want to play something else, and it's not, well, you have a disability, so therefore you must play this one sport. And so I think it's getting creative and figuring out how we design sport and recreation so there's lots of options from an interest standpoint, as well as what is the outcome, this physical literacy of this sport and recreation program, and how can we design it in a way so that all bodies can achieve those outcomes?
And I think that like speaks to a couple of things in my mind too, like what you said about universal design. Like I think they're like in terms of like growth for universal design, like I would love to see those concepts applied to programming too. And I'm not the same way, like I don't see 100% what that looks like in the final product, but like I know it can happen. And I think it's just about, again, a bit of that like trial and error in order to get to that space. Because in Nova Scotia, we actually have been focusing a lot around adapted equipment and equipment loan in general. And I think, again, something just kind of like, I don't know if you're seeing it in Ontario, but like the pandemic's kind of just how can recreation organizations still promote physical activity during this time? And I've had a lot of questions around adapted equipment and what vendors should I consider and what pieces, what, you know, there's these different types of pieces, which one's the best, and it's interesting to me because, you know, I'm like, so how are you going to use this equipment? How are you going to use it? And a lot just say, oh, we're just going to have it available. And it's like, okay, but how can we go that next step? How can we, and we're seeing it almost more in schools right now with the like physical ed programs. We're seeing more like, hey, can you build us a fully inclusive program protocol for a 6-week program that's fully inclusive, involving sport wheelchairs, involving sledges, and I'm like, wow, like, okay, like people want it. They just don't know what it looks like. No one has this like key idea of like how we create this mainstream inclusive opportunity. And I think like, I don't know about you, but for me, I always go back to, yeah, what is the goal? Is the goal to be a competitive sport experience, or is the goal to be an opportunity where everyone's physically, you know, involved and playing and having fun? And maybe that means that we're not playing your traditional basketball game, but rather something else, right? That just looks like basketball, feels like basketball, but has these adapted pieces to it to make it a fully inclusive experience. And I think that's where we need to get out of that mindset of like sports just competitive, right? Like sports just this competitive, like score your points, go, rah, rah. Like I'm like, no, like it doesn't have to
Yeah.
always be that. I mean, I'm a competitive person. I played lacrosse for 11 years. So I don't get me wrong, I love my competition, but I just like there's got to be this space for a little bit of, yeah, I don't know, adaptability.
Well, that's the thing. And I think that it also, from a much bigger, broader standpoint, the fact that, I mean, competitive sport costs money in Canada. And so I mean, I would love to see that change, but especially at the grassroots level, where are kids getting their first introduction to free recreation and play? So
Mhm.
playgrounds is a really big one, and then in daycares and in schools. That's usually kids' first introduction to play, movement, recreation, and so starting there and giving people who run daycares, who build playgrounds, and who like teachers and phys ed who run phys ed programs, the tools and resources, because that's where it begins. And then I certainly think as well, if you're a young child with a disability and you've had, like similar to me, like I had this taste of, I love moving, I love sport, I love recreation. So if I then later on experience barriers, it made me want to fight and say no, like I do deserve better than this, and I do want to keep. And yeah, when we're younger, we're setting up those habits and our identity. Are you an active person? Is this a part of your life? And every child deserves to have that from a physical, emotional, mental standpoint. I mean, we know how important moving and recreation is. And yeah, so I think that we really need to start there and then work our way out.
I'm just curious, and this is a little bit not off topic, but just not the direction I thought I'd go in. But um, have you seen out there, like, you know, when I listen to coaches right now, and I'm talking to community sport orgs, like they're constantly just wondering, like, what inclusion training can I access? Where can I learn? Like, what are those learning opportunities that are currently available to me? And I don't know if you know, but like, are there any opportunities out there for coaches that you see right now that are really like every coach should take this to become, more open-minded, or, not open-minded, but just
Yeah.
intelligent or knowledgeable in this area?
Well, it's a great question. And there's certainly modules out there, but I have not come across yet, personally, something that I thought, oh man, this is it. Like, this is the thing that everyone needs to read, because I have lived with a disability my whole life. I competed in mainstream and parasport. I've been on the governance side of sport, and I am only now diving into a master's and exploring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my mind is just, being blown wide open, because it's not obvious. There are not tools and training. And so I don't have a good answer for that one, other than, I mean, I guess it's similar to how I feel about, how do I become an anti-racist? How do I support Indigenous rights better? How do I, for all of the marginalized groups that I'm not a part of? So I think I feel that way similarly, but just in a different context. And I'm just reading as many books as possible, and doing my own work. I think that there's like an idea out there that, oh, I'll just wait until the training comes to me. But at the end of the day, I think every person living in this world, hopefully wants to be a global citizen, somebody who recognizes we're in this together. How do I live a life and contribute to a world that is safe and meaningful for all people? And of course, right now it's very overwhelming, and we're all stretched thin with COVID, but I still think that we can do our own work, and it's not going up to someone who's different than you and saying, tell me how I can make life better for you. Like that's not fair to people who've experienced marginalization. But there's certainly lots of books out there, and I'm fortunate in my master's, I'm coming across articles, but I can tell you it's been very sad, the lack of research and the lack of books that are out there about how do we make this world a better place for people with disability. I mean, it is quite new, and yeah, so yeah, it's a terrible answer to say, I don't know, but
No, it's not.
I think that just having these conversations is where we start. And we are, like yourself, like a diversity consultant, like that's a job now. I know at least 5 people who have like diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting, and that I would say is new in the last, what would you say, like five years or so? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
it's I've never heard of that before. So I think we're getting there. But like you had said before, a lot of sport and recreation are just kind of like, oh, where do I go from here? But it's just starting, and there is no roadmap. There is no read this book and you've got it. It's just every single day trying to be reflexive in your own thoughts, your own biases, because we have all been conditioned in an ableist way. We have all, like, even myself living with a disability, I have certainly viewed myself and others in a very, very ableist ways. It's just, there's no way around it.
It's society we grew up in, right? Like yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that if my very simple recommendation for everyone is just try and recognize the ways that your thoughts and actions might create harm or marginalization for others. And I'm certainly contributing to that myself as well. And it's overwhelming sometimes, especially when you realize, oh my gosh, I've been using this word and it's just such a harmful word, or I've been participating in these types of actions, and it's hard. So we all need to be gentle with ourselves for sure, because you don't know it until you know it. But then consciously and intentionally going out and trying to challenge our own ways of thinking and our own ways of doing things, because I think also there's just something to be said about creativity, and just, if you look at your program and think, how can this be better for more people, and ask your participants. We don't give kids enough credit. Ask them how their experience was. I say, hey, like, if you could design this differently, how would you make it? And I think that we have a very underused resource in kids, and tapping into their experiences.
I wholeheartedly agree. It's always interesting to hear their mindsets on things. They're just very creative and, yeah, inspirational people to talk to when we're feeling that brain kind of fart, and it's like, oh, like, where do I go from here? I can only see the one direction. So No, I think you gave some great points, and I just want to say thank you for giving the time today that you have. I'm really blown away by your just thinking and your experiences, and I completely agree. And I think there's nothing wrong with like identifying that, yeah, this is a very young and like novice kind of subject matter still. And you know, in North America, like you can look to some other places and see, you know, there's growth happening in different ways, but like we all are learning, we're all growing, we're all navigating this inclusion, diversity, access kind of subject, and especially in sport and recreation where there's a lot of different environments we have to adapt in that world, right? So thank you for contributing and just, yeah, influencing the conversation, really. That's what the conference is about.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's always, I mean, I think this is how the ideas and the creativity starts flowing. It's just having conversation with other people who are really passionate as well. And I'm certainly leaving this conversation with new ideas and feeling very uplifted and inspired. So thank you for creating the space for these kind of conversations.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to today's conversation on Influencing the Shift 3.0. Influencing the Shift would not be possible without the Northern Inclusion Access Committee. Its representatives are made up from varying organizations within the northern region of Nova Scotia, including partners from East Hants, Colchester, Pictou, and Cumberland counties. These partners identified a gap in service delivery within the sport and recreation sector when providing opportunities for persons living with disability. We all play an important role in shifting towards a more inclusive sport and recreation sector for individuals with varying abilities. Let's start by influencing the shift.